There comes a moment in life when you realize the most exhausting thing you've been doing is asking to be chosen, not loudly, not desperately, but subtly, by shrinking yourself, by waiting, by hoping someone finally sees your worth and says, yes, you're enough. And that moment hurts because you understand something painful. You gave people the power to decide your value. Today isn't about anger. It's not about blaming love, people, or the past. Today is about freedom. The freedom that comes when you stop auditioning for affection, when you stop negotiating your self-respect, and when you finally understand that being chosen by others means nothing if you've abandoned yourself. This is about standing still, standing honest, and choosing you without apology, without fear, and without waiting for permission. There is a quiet habit many people develop without ever noticing when it begins. It doesn't arrive loudly or violently. It forms slowly, disguised as patience, kindness, or hope. It looks harmless at first. You wait, you adjust, you give the benefit of the doubt. You tell yourself that love takes time, that people are complicated, that circumstances will change. And somewhere in that waiting, you stop standing fully in yourself. You begin asking without words to be chosen, not once, but repeatedly, not directly, but through endurance, through silence, through tolerating less than what you feel. This is the silent cost no one warns you about. When you demand to be chosen, you don't always realize you are making a demand. It doesn't feel like a demand. It feels like hope. It feels like loyalty. It feels like holding on. But beneath it is a quiet surrender of power. You are placing your worth into someone else's hands and standing still, watching to see what they decide to do with it. And every time they hesitate, every time they look away, every time they choose something or someone else, a small fracture forms inside you. Not enough to break you all at once, but enough to weaken you over time. The most dangerous part is that this habit feels normal. You see it everywhere. In relationships where one person gives more and asks for less, in friendships where effort is one-sided, in workplaces where people overextend themselves hoping recognition will finally arrive. Society often praises this behavior. It calls it sacrifice. It calls it commitment. It calls it love. But rarely does it ask what it costs the person doing all the waiting. Rarely does it ask how many pieces of themselves they left behind in the process. When you ask to be chosen, you start editing yourself. You soften your voice. You lower your needs. You delay your boundaries. You convince yourself that if you just become a little more understanding, a little more flexible, a little less demanding, then maybe this time you'll be enough. And the tragedy is not that others don't choose you. The tragedy is that you stop choosing yourself long before they ever make a decision. Over time, this creates a deep internal confusion. You begin to associate love with anxiety. You associate connection with uncertainty. You mistake inconsistency for depth. You start believing that intensity is intimacy, that longing is meaning. You measure your value by how hard you are willing to wait, how much you are willing to endure. And without realizing it, you train yourself to feel comfortable in imbalance. The cost shows up quietly in your body, in the way your chest tightens when you see their name, in the way your stomach drops when hours pass without a response, in the way your thoughts loop at night, replaying conversations, searching for signs, reading between lines that were never meant to hold meaning. You call it caring, you call it attachment. But your nervous system knows the truth. It knows when you are not safe. It knows when your worth is being negotiated. Demanding to be chosen also changes the way you see yourself. You stop asking what you want and start asking what will keep them. Your identity bends around someone else's preferences. You become reactive instead of rooted. You lose touch with your own rhythm because you are constantly adjusting to theirs. And slowly, subtly, you forget what it feels like to be met instead of managed, to be wanted instead of tolerated. What makes this pattern so painful is that it often begins with good intentions. You didn't set out to abandon yourself. You just cared. You just believed. You just hoped. But hope without self-respect turns into self-erasure. And belief without boundaries turns into self-betrayal. The line between love and loss becomes thin when your sense of worth depends on someone else's decision. There is also a strange pride that can form around this suffering. You tell yourself that your ability to endure proves your depth, that your patience makes you stronger, that your loyalty sets you apart, and in some ways it does. But strength that comes at the cost of your dignity is not strength. It is survival. And survival is not the same as living. The longer you demand to be chosen, the more you normalize crumbs. You learn to celebrate bare minimum effort. A message after silence feels like connection. A half commitment feels like progress. An apology without change feels like closure. You begin lowering the bar so often that you forget where it was meant to be, and each time you do, something inside you goes quiet. There is a deep loneliness that exists even when you are not alone. It's the loneliness of not being fully seen, of not being fully claimed, of existing in someone's life as a possibility instead of a priority. And when you live there long enough, you start believing that this is all love is meant to be, that wanting more is asking too much, that expecting clarity is being demanding, that choosing yourself is selfish. But the truth is, love that requires you to beg for presence is not love, it is imbalance. Connection that demands self-abandonment is not connection, it is attachment rooted in fear. And a bond that survives only through your silence is not a bond, it is a transaction where you are paying with your self-worth. The cost becomes most visible when you finally stop, when you pause long enough to notice how tired you are. Not tired from doing too much, but tired from being too little for too long. Tired of waiting, tired of guessing, tired of holding space for someone who never fully stepped into yours. That exhaustion is not weakness, it is your system telling you that something is wrong. When you demand to be chosen, you delay your own life. You put your growth on hold. You postpone joy. You tell yourself that once this person decides, then you'll move forward, then you'll feel secure, then you'll be whole. But life does not pause with you. Time continues. Opportunities pass. Versions of you that could have existed quietly disappear. There is also grief involved. Grief for the version of yourself that believed love would arrive if you just waited long enough. Grief for the moments you dimmed your light. Grief for the boundaries you ignored. And grief for the realization that no one ever asked you to do all that. You volunteered, hoping it would be returned. The most painful realization is understanding that demanding to be chosen teaches others how to treat you, not because they are cruel, but because humans respond to what is allowed. When you stay without clarity, people learn that clarity is optional. When you give without reciprocity, people learn that effort is negotiable. When you accept uncertainty, people learn that your presence does not require commitment. This pattern does not mean you are weak. It means you are human. It means you have the capacity to attach deeply. It means you feel things fully. Those are not flaws, but without self-awareness, those strengths can turn inward and harm you. Love should not require self-destruction to be proven. At some point, the question shifts. It stops being, why won't they choose me? And becomes, why am I waiting to be chosen? That question is uncomfortable. It removes the focus from them and places it back on you. It asks you to confront your fears of abandonment, your need for validation, your belief that love must be earned. It asks you to sit with yourself without distraction. Demanding to be chosen is often rooted in the fear that choosing yourself means being alone, that if you stop waiting, nothing will replace what you leave behind. But what you don't see while you're waiting is how crowded your inner world has become with anxiety, doubt, and longing. That is also a form of loneliness. When you stop demanding to be chosen, you don't immediately feel strong. At first, you feel exposed. You feel the absence of the hope you clung to. You feel the weight of your own needs. And that can be frightening. But it is also the beginning of honesty. And honesty is the foundation of real connection. The cost of demanding to be chosen is not just emotional. It shapes your future relationships. It teaches you patterns that repeat until they are broken. It teaches you to overgive, overexplain, overstay, and unless you become aware of it, you carry it with you into every connection, mistaking familiarity for fate. There is a moment when you realize that being chosen is not the prize you thought it was, because being chosen by someone who does not see you fully, who does not meet you with consistency, who does not choose you freely, is not victory. It is compromise disguised as success. You were never meant to audition for your place in someone's life. You were never meant to shrink to fit someone else's uncertainty, and you were never meant to prove your worth through endurance. The cost of forgetting that is steep, but the awareness of it is powerful. Once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. You notice how often you silence yourself, how often you wait for permission, how often you confuse attachment with connection. And that awareness begins to change you, even if slowly, even if quietly. Demanding to be chosen keeps you looking outward for confirmation instead of inward for truth. It keeps your focus on anyone else's decision instead of your own standards. And the longer you stay there, the further you drift from who you are when you are not trying to be enough for someone else. There is nothing noble about abandoning yourself to be loved. There is nothing romantic about uncertainty that erodes your peace. And there is nothing powerful about waiting for someone to recognize what you already are. The cost is paid in small moments, in the pause before you speak, in the message you don't send, in the boundary you don't set, in the feeling you dismiss. And one day, you look back and realize how much of yourself you traded for the hope of being chosen. Self-respect is rarely loud. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand attention or applause. Most of the time, it exists in quiet decisions no one else sees. In the moments when you choose not to explain yourself, when you don't chase clarity from someone who has already shown you confusion, when you walk away without creating a scene. Validation, on the other hand, is noisy inside your mind. It asks questions constantly. Am I enough? Did I do something wrong? Should I try harder? Should I wait longer? And when validation becomes more important than self-respect, your inner world becomes restless. The need for validation often begins early. You learn that approval feels safe, that being liked feels like belonging, that being wanted feels like worth. Over time, this learning turns into a habit. You start measuring yourself through reactions, through responses, through attention. And slowly, without realizing it, you hand over authority. You let others become the mirror through which you see yourself. When they reflect warmth, you feel valuable. When they withdraw, you feel diminished. Self-respect challenges this pattern. It asks you to become your own reference point, to decide who you are without waiting for agreement, to hold your ground even when it costs you comfort. That is why self-respect feels difficult at first. It removes the illusion that someone else will stabilize you. It forces you to stand in your own truth without external reinforcement. Validation is addictive because it feels like relief. A message arrives and your chest loosens, a compliment lands and your mood lifts. Someone chooses you and the noise inside your head quiets for a moment. But the relief never lasts, because validation is temporary. It depends on conditions you do not control. And the more you rely on it, the more powerless you feel when it disappears. When validation leads, your behavior shifts. You say yes when you mean no. You tolerate disrespect because confrontation risks rejection. You stay silent because speaking might change how someone sees you. And every time you do this, self-respect steps back. Not all at once. Just enough for you to notice later when you feel disconnected from yourself. Self-respect does not guarantee approval. In fact, it often does the opposite. When you stop bending, some people become uncomfortable. When you stop overgiving, some people feel deprived. When you stop explaining, some people feel challenged. This is where many people retreat. They mistake discomfort for danger. They confuse being misunderstood with being wrong. But self-respect is not about being understood by everyone. It is about being aligned with yourself. It is about knowing that your boundaries are not punishments, but protections, that your standards are not arrogance, but clarity, that your needs are not inconveniences, but signals. Validation asks you to perform. Self-respect asks you to be. Validation wants you to adapt constantly. Self-respect wants you to remain consistent. Validation thrives on comparison. Self-respect dissolves it. When you respect yourself, you no longer need to compete for attention because your value is not on trial. There's a loneliness that can appear when you choose self-respect. Not the loneliness of absence, but the loneliness of separation. You separate from patterns that once defined you, from dynamics that once felt familiar, from versions of yourself that survived by pleasing. That loneliness can feel sharp at first because you are no longer distracted by approval. You are present with yourself. Self-respect also means accepting disappointment without self-blame. It means recognizing when someone cannot meet you without turning that into a verdict on your worth. It means letting people go without rewriting your value downward to make sense of their behavior. This is difficult because the mind prefers explanations that maintain connection, even if they harm you. Validation often keeps you trapped in potential. You stay because of what could be, because of who they might become, because of the version of the relationship you imagine. Self-respect anchors you in reality. It asks you to respond to what is happening, not what you hope will happen. And reality, while sometimes painful, is always honest. When self-respect becomes your priority, your decisions slow down. You pause before reacting. You listen to your body. You notice tension instead of ignoring it. You stop forcing alignment where it doesn't exist. And in that slowing down, clarity emerges. Not dramatic clarity, quiet clarity, the kind that doesn't need justification. Validation seeks reassurance from others. Self-respect generates reassurance internally. This doesn't mean you stop valuing connection. It means connection becomes a choice, not a requirement for self-stability. You no longer need someone to confirm your worth for you to feel grounded, and that changes how you show up. People often confuse self-respect with rigidity. They think it means closing off, becoming cold, or pushing others out. But true self-respect is flexible without being fragile. It allows vulnerability without self-sacrifice. It welcomes love without negotiating dignity. It says you can be close without disappearing. There is a subtle confidence that comes from self-respect, not the kind that seeks attention, but the kind that doesn't need it. It shows in the way you speak, in the way you leave situations that feel wrong without creating drama, in the way you stop explaining your choices to people who are committed to misunderstanding you. Validation-based living keeps you scanning, reading moods, anticipating reactions, adjusting constantly. It keeps your nervous system alert. Self-respect allows rest, because when you trust yourself, you no longer need to monitor everything outside of you. You stop living in anticipation and start living in presence. Choosing self-respect often reveals who was benefiting from your lack of it. Some connections weaken, some dynamics collapse, some people distance themselves. This can feel like loss, but what is actually happening is exposure. The relationship was sustained by your self-abandonment, not by mutual respect. Self-respect also changes the questions you ask. Instead of asking, "Do they like me?" you ask, "Do I feel safe here?" Instead of asking, "How do I keep this?" you ask, "Does this honor me?" Instead of asking, "What should I do to be chosen?" you ask, "Is this something I would choose?" Validation is often reactive. Self-respect is intentional. Validation depends on timing, mood, circumstances. Self-respect depends on values. And values remain even when emotions fluctuate. They guide you when desire clouds judgment. They anchor you when attachment pulls you toward compromise. There is grief in choosing self-respect. Grief for relationships that only worked when you were smaller. Grief for the approval you once relied on. Grief for the comfort of being liked at the expense of being honest. But this grief is clean. It doesn't corrode you. It clears space. When self-respect leads, love feels different. It feels calmer. It feels safer. It feels mutual. You are no longer trying to earn affection through effort or endurance. You are allowing connection to meet you where you stand. And if it cannot, you let it pass without chasing. Self-respect does not make you invulnerable. It makes you resilient. You still feel disappointment. You still feel rejection. But you no longer collapse inward when it happens. You don't turn pain into proof of unworthiness. You allow it to exist without rewriting your identity. Validation teaches you to seek permission. Self-respect teaches you to trust your judgment. And trust is built through consistency with yourself, through keeping your word to yourself, through honoring your limits, through walking away when something compromises your peace. There's a quiet freedom that comes when validation loses its grip. You stop living in reaction to others. You stop outsourcing your self-image. You stop asking for confirmation before honoring your feelings. And that freedom is not loud or dramatic. It is steady. It is grounding. Self-respect does not guarantee ease, but it guarantees integrity, and integrity creates a kind of peace that validation never can, because validation is borrowed. Self-respect is owned, and what you own cannot be taken from you by silence, distance, or rejection. There is a moment of quiet realization that changes everything. It doesn't come with drama or sudden confidence. It arrives slowly, often after exhaustion, after disappointment repeats itself too many times, after you notice a familiar pattern playing out again and again. The realization is simple but heavy. No one is coming to choose you in the way you need. And more importantly, no one ever was meant to. That moment is not defeat. It is the beginning of power returning to where it belongs. For a long time, power feels external. It feels like something others hold. Their decisions determine your direction. Their approval determines your stability. Their commitment determines your security. You wait for green lights. You wait for certainty. You wait for someone else's readiness to align with your own needs. And while you wait, your life exists in suspension. Self-selection disrupts this waiting. It removes the illusion that power lives outside of you. It shifts the center of gravity inward. Instead of asking whether you are wanted, you begin asking whether something aligns with you. Instead of adjusting yourself to fit into someone else's uncertainty, you begin noticing when something does not fit your values, your pace, or your emotional capacity. Reclaiming power through self-selection feels unfamiliar at first. It feels like standing without a script, without reassurance, without applause. You are no longer reacting to what others do or don't offer. You are deciding, and decision carries responsibility. Responsibility can feel heavy when you are used to deferring choice to someone else. When you self-select, you stop asking permission to exist fully. You stop minimizing your needs to remain acceptable. You stop explaining why you deserve consistency, effort, or clarity. You recognize that these are not rewards to be earned, but requirements for connection. And that recognition changes how you move through the world. Power is often misunderstood as control over others, but real power is control over your participation, over what you engage in, over what you tolerate, over what you invest your time, energy, and emotion into. Self-selection is not about domination, it is about discernment. At first, self-selection can feel like loss. You step away from situations that once defined you. You withdraw from dynamics that kept you emotionally occupied. You create space where noise once lived, and in that space you feel the absence sharply, not because what you left was healthy, but because it was familiar. Familiarity has a strong pull. It convinces you that discomfort is danger, that letting go is failure, that choosing yourself means abandoning connection. But self-selection is not rejection of others. It is refusal to reject yourself any longer. When you reclaim power, you notice how often you gave it away unconsciously, in the way you waited for replies, in the way you adjusted your tone, in the way you delayed your truth, in the way you stayed available even when you felt depleted. None of these actions were wrong. They were adaptive. They helped you survive in environments where your needs were not centered. But survival is not the same as choice. Self-selection moves you out of survival and into intention. You begin to ask different questions. Not how do I make this work, but is this working for me? Not what do they need from me, but what do I need to feel safe, seen, and respected? Power returns quietly. It doesn't announce itself through confrontation. It shows up in restraint, in the pause before responding, in the decision not to chase clarity, in the willingness to sit with uncertainty without filling it with effort. That restraint is strength. It signals that your worth is not dependent on immediate validation. Self-selection also exposes imbalance quickly. When you stop overfunctioning, gaps become visible. When you stop initiating, silence speaks. When you stop compensating, effort reveals itself. This can be uncomfortable because it removes the illusion that things were mutual when they were not. There is grief in this exposure, grief for the time you spent hoping, grief for the version of the connection you imagined, grief for the energy you invested without return. But grief is part of reclaiming power. It acknowledges what was lost without trying to recreate it. As you self-select, your nervous system begins to recalibrate. You are no longer living in anticipation. You are no longer scanning for signs. You are no longer interpreting ambiguity as potential. Your body starts to recognize what consistency feels like, what clarity feels like, what ease feels like. Power reclaimed through self-selection also changes your relationship with rejection. Rejection no longer feels like erasure, it feels like information. It tells you where alignment does not exist, and information is useful. It guides your next decision instead of defining your worth. You stop personalizing other people's limitations. You understand that their inability to choose you says more about their capacity than your value. And with that understanding, you stop trying to prove yourself to those who are not equipped to meet you. Self-selection requires courage because it often means standing alone before standing aligned. There may be periods where your life feels quieter, where your calendar is emptier, where your emotional energy has no obvious place to go. This quiet can feel unsettling if you are used to chaos as connection, but quiet creates space for discernment. In that space, you begin to notice what you actually want, not what you were conditioned to accept. You reconnect with your preferences, your boundaries become clearer, your intuition becomes louder because it is no longer competing with constant noise. Power is also reclaimed when you stop explaining your decisions to people who benefit from your doubt. You realize that clarity does not require consensus, that your reasons are valid even if they are not understood, that you do not owe access to everyone who desires it. Self-selection changes how you show up in future connections. You are no longer trying to be impressive. You are trying to be honest. You are no longer auditioning for a role. You are observing compatibility. And that shift reduces anxiety because you are no longer performing for approval. There is a steadiness that comes from choosing yourself repeatedly, not once but daily, in small moments, in how you respond to disrespect, in how you honor your limits, in how you leave situations that compromise your peace. These choices build trust with yourself, and self-trust is a form of power no one can take from you. You begin to feel less urgency, less pressure to secure, comes less fear of endings, because when you trust yourself to choose yourself, endings lose their threat. You know you will not abandon yourself to keep something alive. Self-selection also dismantles fantasy. You stop falling in love with potential. You stop investing in promises instead of patterns. You stop mistaking words for action. This does not make you cynical. It makes you grounded. Power is reclaimed when you realize that being chosen is not the same as being valued. Someone can choose you out of convenience, fear, or habit. Value shows up through consistency, effort, and respect. Self-selection trains you to recognize the difference. As power returns, your standards rise naturally, not because you think you are better than others, but because you are no longer willing to negotiate your well-being. Your standards are not walls, they are filters. They protect what matters to you. You stop confusing intensity with depth. You stop romanticizing struggle. You stop equating pain with meaning. You understand that love does not need to hurt to be real, and connection does not need to be earned through endurance. Self-selection does not make you immune to loneliness, but it makes loneliness honest. It is no longer crowded with self-betrayal. It is no longer filled with hoping someone will change. It becomes a space where you can hear yourself clearly. Power also returns when you stop rushing intimacy. when you allow trust to build at its own pace, when you let people reveal themselves instead of projecting onto them. This patience is not passive, it is observant. You become less reactive. You stop chasing explanations. You stop demanding closure from people who cannot give it. You understand that clarity is often found in behavior, not conversation. As you continue choosing yourself, your confidence becomes quieter. You no longer need to announce boundaries. You simply live by them. You no longer need to threaten departure. You leave when alignment ends. You no longer need to convince anyone of your worth. Self-selection reshapes your identity. You are no longer defined by who stayed or who left. You are defined by how you stayed true to yourself through it all, and that identity is stable. There is relief in realizing that your life does not hinge on someone else's decision, that your happiness is not postponed by someone else's hesitation, that your future does not require external permission. Power reclaimed through self-selection is not aggressive. It is calm, it is steady, it is grounded. It does not seek revenge or validation. It simply refuses to participate in dynamics that require self-abandonment. You begin to recognize your own presence as enough, not because you no longer desire connection, but because you no longer need it to feel whole. And from that place, whatever enters your life does so by choice, not by necessity. You stop waiting to be chosen because you understand that you already are, by yourself. Every time you honor your truth, every time you walk away from what diminishes you, every time you remain aligned even when it costs you comfort, and in that alignment, power settles back into your body, to your voice, into your decisions, into your silence, not as something you perform, but as something you embody.